Good morning. This is Haley Solomon with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Housing Policy, Stephanie Watkins-Cruz.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you are having a great week so far. I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with an important reminder. Next week is our Bringing It Home conference, so we will not be having a housing call next Tuesday. Moving on to federal updates. Just want to remind folks that the National Low Income Housing Coalition is urging us and reminding us advocates to comment in support of the Department of Housing and Urban Development's recent notice of proposed rulemaking, specifically looking at reducing the barriers to HUD-assisted housing for looking at people with a history of involvement in the criminal legal system and addressing the existing screening regulations for those applicants with conviction histories or, again, that history of involvement. The proposed changes would reduce the unnecessary barriers to HUD-assisted housing that often prevent people impacted by the criminal legal system from accessing housing unnecessarily. The deadline for advocates to submit comments is June 10th, so make sure that you check out the link in the call notes and you submit your thoughts there. Several different funding announcements have been made by the Biden-Harris administration as well as HUD. The recently announced funding from the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program, the GRRP, under President Biden's Investing in America agenda, announced nearly $67 million in new funding awards, and this program has now awarded more than $610 million. These grants and loans are going to keep more than 14,000 properties that are housing low-income individuals, families, and seniors safer and more comfortable, particularly during extreme weather events. HUD is also making $26 million available to promote fair housing and root out discrimination. This new funding is being made available via non-competitive funding through the Fair Housing Assistance Program. The Fair Housing Assistance Program is an intergovernmental partnership between the federal government and state and local agencies to provide protection to the public against discrimination in housing. The funding typically goes to supporting investigations, education, and outreach activities. And last but not least, the Biden-Harris administration has announced nearly $10.5 million in available funding for communities to plan or invest in infrastructure in order to allow for housing to be near transit. And this is in partnership with the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Federal Transit Administration. This pilot program for transit-oriented development, or TOD, planning, this program specifically supports local planning and investment near transit hubs to promote sustainable, livable, and equitable communities, and it has a special focus on projects that also plan for affordable housing. Moving to state legislative updates. So last week we had our legislative day. The policy team was in Raleigh, and we had a great day. We met with several different elected officials. We met with Representative Caleb Rudow, Senator Craig Meyer, Representative Julie Von Hafen, Representative Jason Sain, and Senator Steve Jarvis. And so thank you so much to those elected officials and to their staff for allowing us to take up some of their time. During those meetings, we talked about investing in the Housing Trust Fund at a larger scale and also making the Workforce Housing Loan Program a recurring allocation because it's still not a recurring allocation, and just the importance of affordable housing overall. We also talked about allocating remaining state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars as well as any ARPA dollars, so American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and budget surplus dollars to housing. The federal funds in particular, we just emphasize how well-equipped and designed housing is to spend those remaining federal dollars from that historic sort of slew of investment. And since those have a deadline to be spent by next year, what better cause than housing to spend it with? We also asked them to consider and begin thinking about planning for the future of disaster recovery and resilience as the dollars for that particular activity began to run out as it pertains to Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. And so although that funding is coming to an end, we've learned a lot of lessons over the last several years and want to make sure that as a state, we can hold on to those lessons and that we can move accordingly and plan so that we can be more resilient and plan better for the future. We also talked a bit about supporting internal coordination at the state level for housing functions and resources. As we get deeper into this sort of affordable housing crisis across our state, coordination is even more important. We have a lot of housing functions spread across our state, and we want to make sure that our resources are used to have the best impact they possibly can, and that does require coordination and requires the support of our elected bodies for that coordination. So, in our call notes, if you missed last week's call to action announcement, don't worry, we have our talking points in the call notes for you. We're going to ask you to reach out to your representative with a few calls to action, similar to what we just went over, asking them to grow the North Carolina Housing Trust Fund, to make the Workforce Housing Loan Program a recurring allocation, and to increase the allocation for the WELP program. We also ask that you remind them to prepare accordingly for the end of disaster relief dollars and to think about long-term sustainability by leveraging the expertise and lessons that we've learned from recent disaster responses. And then also to support and consider how to improve statewide coordination of housing functions and resources in order to optimize our resource allocation and impact across the state. So all of that will be in the call notes for you. And we just want to highlight that as we learn more and as we continue to build different relationships and better relationships in the General Assembly, we'll point out how those conversations go and we'll update you all accordingly. Moving on to local updates, we have several pieces of news across the state. There is a new portal in Buncombe County that is geared towards helping people find affordable housing. We also have a piece in the Indy that talks about how Durham is considering more funding for an eviction diversion program. An eviction diversion program, this is a reminder for you all, we haven't talked about it in a little bit, but this is a great example of a stabilization measure or intervention when it comes to housing relief or housing solutions. Another piece from Cumberland County talks about property tax relief programs. The deadline for this is June 1st, and so that is the end of this week. If you are in that area, make sure you check out that link for that program. Additionally, in the Outer Banks, there is a threat to sue a Dare County Commissioner candidate, and so we'll be following that battle for a little bit to see kind of how that impacts the local politics as well as housing decisions. Moving to events, there is a webinar on May 30th from 3 p.m. to 4:30 called Screened Out, How the Biden Administration Can Open Doors for Housing to Justice-Involved People and Their Families, hosted by the Fair Share Housing Center and the Drug Policy Alliance from 3 to 4:30 p.m. So again, this is a webinar. There's also, if you are familiar with, or even if you're not familiar with the Women's Affordable Housing Network, they're having their National Housing Summit this year in Atlanta, Georgia on June 9th through the 11th, and registration is still open, so we'll have that link in the call notes for you. Another virtual event hosted by the Bipartisan Policy Center, the 2024 Summit on Housing Supply Solutions from 9:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. So there'll be various sessions and different webinars as part of that full-day summit, but you are able to participate virtually if you'd like to watch. Also on June 11th, if you want to take a break for a really great, what will sure be a great webinar, hosted by the National Fair Housing Alliance, Advancing Equity with First Generation Homebuyer Program, from 2 to 3 p.m., featuring Nikitra Bailey and Tracy Colores, so two of our greats here from North Carolina. Wanted to highlight and lift that up, so definitely recommend checking out that program. Another webinar, June 20th, from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m., hosted by the Urban Institute and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, looking at the lessons from 40 years of public housing policies and where do we go from here. So looking at the historical context of public housing policy and the lessons we've learned and how to kind of move forward in housing interventions. And last but certainly not least, also on June 20th, the State of the Nation's Housing 2024 report is being released by the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard at 12 p.m. on June 20th. So this is a webinar, and they'll be talking about their findings in that report. We have several reports and resources for you all in the call notes today. one that relates to one of the webinars. It's titled First Generation Foundations, A Guide to Advancing Equity with First Generation Homeownership Programs. This report is by the National Fair Housing Alliance and is a great look at what really makes first generation homebuyer programs different and how to really implement these programs and use them as a way to advance equity when it comes to homeownership and wealth building. There's also another report by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and Pew Charitable Trust titled Homeowners, Renters, and Households of All Incomes Back Housing Reforms, looking at just how widespread support for housing reform really is across all income levels and across all tenant or homeowner types. There's another great recording from PolicyLink looking at how fulfilling the Fair Housing Act's promise to the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule is going. So we have a link to that recording as well. In the news, housing continues to be a key topic. One thing I'm going to list up out west, which is something that we've begun to see over several places, not just in the west, but across the country, is we're starting to see a lot of places look at different interventions as it comes for eviction or tenant protections. And so this is a type of stabilizing intervention that we're seeing more and more attention being given to. So in Colorado recently passed for-cause eviction protections. This was led by the Colorado Homes for All Coalition, where organizers and advocates have successfully won for-cause eviction, or HB 24-1098, through their state legislature, which will benefit hundreds of thousands of renters in Colorado. This law actually went into effect on April 19, 2024, and prevents discriminatory and retaliatory evictions and leases and lease non-renewal. So really key, important protections there. There's also a really great piece about America's biggest Medicaid insurer just pledging to help build nearly $1 billion of affordable housing. And them acknowledging that we know 80% of what drives health is non-medical. So seeing this type of private entity really invest in affordable housing, recognizing those social determinants of health, that's getting a lot of headlines. We have several other pieces in there for you to look at today. If you have any questions or want to know who to reach out to, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Let us know how it goes when you reach out to your representatives and when you have these conversations with them. And again, remember, next week there will be no housing call, but we will be back the following week. And we can't wait to see many of you at our Bringing It Home conference. Thank you and have a great rest of your week.